Good evening, morning, good day, everyone. I know we've got people joining from all parts of the world. My name is Thando Vilarazi. I am the director of the Center for Competition, Regulation, and Economic Development, CRED, which is housed at the University of Johannesburg. This is quite an exciting platform for us, and the third in a series of webinars that has been generously supported and kind of in partnership with the African Climate Foundation, and this is primarily through its African Food Systems Transformation Collective, and information about that is available on the African Climate Foundation's website. The first webinar actually looked at issues around concentration, mergers and prices in African food markets. It then shifted focus slightly to focus on issues around barriers to entry and participation, market access, facing smaller market participants in African food systems. And so in many ways, we see today's webinar as trying to bring these issues together and drawing together the threads, in that a big part of our understanding, and I think we have a shared understanding of this, is that food markets, for them to be sustainable, to be inclusive, to be effective in this continent, also require important leadership and participation and activity by our competition regulators and effective institutions across the board. At the very least, to set the kind of rules that we'd like to see that enable level playing field for market participants. I think this is in the context, of course, of issues and increasing pressures on our food systems from climate change and the kind of very significant shifts we're seeing already in different parts of the continent as well. But also looking forward in this webinar to what types of gaps and challenges we face at the level of enforcement, given that we know at least something about, and maybe not all we need to know about, the challenges at the market level that are arising in these markets. What challenges do authorities face in enforcement? And is there scope for reform or reform agenda towards enabling greater enforcement and ultimately achieving this kind of level playing field? On the call with me today is a great panel of experts that have worked on these issues from very different angles, but I think with a kind of common understanding that these are important issues, but that also the time to act is now. We've been speaking about challenges in Africa's food markets, food security, hunger, and poverty for many, many years and decades. But really, it's quite important that those institutions that can act, and we focused here on issues around competition law agencies, for instance, start to play that role where they are able to. And so we've drawn together a panel of experts around this. I'll announce them or kind of introduce them in the order in which they'll speak shortly. Firstly being Carin, who's the Executive Director of the Shamba Center for Food and Climate, who will kind of give us a sense of the state of play, kind of the state of knowledge, if you will, around these issues and foreground our discussion to some extent. I'll then ask Professor Eleanor, who's a professor of law at the New York University, Professor Emeritus at the New York University, who's been working tirelessly on these issues at the level of kind of the ICN, but also with competition authorities throughout the continent, research centers, etc., to really put forward this agenda around the importance of effective markets for dealing with issues, in particular of poverty and hunger, but also tracking the evolution and growth and challenges that institutions have faced over time, including a number of kind of really important authored pieces that are widely available as well. And then lastly, we have Mr. Chilufya Sampa, who operates now as an independent consultant, sharing his wisdom across the continent and his experiences. But of course, many of you also know that Mr. Sampa is the former head of the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission of Zambia. And so there's an important perspective there, in that even as some of us may sit here at our desks in Johannesburg and kind of theorize about enforcement and why authorities need to act and how important these issues are, I think Mr. Sampa will bring a very fresh perspective around some of the kind of on-the-ground challenges, but also opportunities for authorities in terms of tackling some of these kind of really important issues in food systems. I think that's the kind of total of the background that I wanted to provide. Carin will be speaking to in the background to some of the discussion also relates to work that some of my colleagues here have done on a paper called Reforming Competition, on a paper called Empowering African Food Producers and Agri-Enterprises through Strong Competition Law and Policy. And so Carin will speak to that initially and some of the very important, I think, and pressing recommendations that arise from that. And then I'll open up for responses from Eleanor and Mr. Sampa. What we're hoping to do is that by the by the bottom of the hour at least, so in about 20 minutes time, we'd be able to transition into a more open discussion. And I'm really encouraging those on the call that have joined us, and there's many of you, to please already start to put your comments, questions in the Q&A. And of course, feel free to also introduce yourself and your organization in the chat box as well. There might be important links and things that might be made there as well. So any questions that you may have throughout the discussion, please load them into the Q&A and I'll try and pick some of those out. And then we'll have an open discussion later. We'll also enable participants in the call that would like to raise their questions on voice or even video to be able to do so. So you maybe just want to indicate in the chat or in the Q&A function, should you wish to do so. Alternatively, please write it into the chat. Right, I think that's certainly enough from me. Reforming competition regimes in Africa for sustainable food systems. Not an easy task. Carin, do you want to put up your presentation, and we're giving you a first go at what is actually a really difficult topic.
So hi everyone. Thanks, Tando, and hi everyone, and thanks for having me here. So as you mentioned, I've been tasked with giving a bit of the state of play based on this report that I co-authored with a few other people that you see here below in white, about empowering African producers and agri-food SMEs through stronger enforcement of competition laws and policies. And whilst I am going to do that, I think the words you echoed just earlier, Tando, about the time to act is now, I think could never be stronger. So before I go into what we looked at in the state of play on this topic, I just want to start by pointing people to 3 new reports in addition to ours that have come out. I mean, 2 of them came out last week, the one by the Balanced Economy Project and the one by Oxfam during Davos, the World Economic Forum. And then the other one came out at the end of last year. And I think they're reports, but they're more like calling for movements, global movements, than they are really academic reports. I think they're worth a read. And I think they're worth a read because for me, what these reports signal and the groundswell that they've managed to attract is that there's now a strong movement globally of governments, of people, of citizens, of consumer groups, of producer groups, who are saying, if we don't properly enforce competition law and policy, we are not going to stop this anti-competitive conduct in the market that we see increasing year by year dramatically. And what these reports, particularly the Oxfam one and the Balanced Economy Project one, are trying to say is that basically the monopoly power that we have allowed to take place in the past decades is basically responsible for poverty, for hunger, for fueling climate change, environmental destruction. That if you look at the trends towards growing concentration and market power and monopolies, that's what you're seeing. Now, what these reports don't do is they don't really focus on Africa. So I'm going to go a little bit more deeper into the situation in Africa, because that's what we did look at in our report. But I think these reports are so important because so many of the issues that they highlight are relevant to what's happening in Africa. And so much of this movement, I think Africa could benefit from. And what these 4 reports have in common is that they all say that it doesn't need to be this way. That countries, most countries, have the legal measures and the mechanisms to be able to counter this anti-competitive conduct, this tendency towards monopolies. They're just not doing it. And yet what we have seen in the last few years is a much more activist and reform-minded agenda coming out of the US and Europe, where we're starting to see things happen. So the Balanced Economy Project report talks about we have early signs of an awakening in Europe and the US. The message is very clear. Things are starting to happen. We have the frameworks in place. So, you know, we talk about reform, Tando, but actually these reports say you don't need that much legal reform or policy reform. What you need is to enforce the laws and the policies that are in place. So encourage you to read it. But now to the report that we worked on. So the purpose of the report was fourfold. It was first to confirm that, yes, indeed, market concentration is a problem in African agriculture and food systems, and it is harming producers, SMEs, and consumers. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because the other webinars did deal with that, and I'm assuming that the group that's here with us today knows very well about that market concentration and the harm. I'm then going to look at what the state of competition law and policy is in Africa, which might be surprising to some. And then talk about, okay, what's the way forward for African competition authorities? What can they do to help empower producers and SMEs better? And then lastly, because I'm convinced that none of this can happen unless we get the development community to help support and to start investing in the kinds of data, institutions, capacity building and support that's needed for this reform agenda. So just briefly, and I won't go into this too much, but we first start by looking at anti-competitive conduct in Africa. And we do find that indeed cartels are widespread. Cartels have been found and investigated by a number of competition authorities around fertilizers, poultry, maize, wheat, bread, dairy. So it's definitely happening. There are definitely a lot of cartels. And linked to that, there is a suppression of farmer prices and the charging of excessive markups to buyers. So this we see a lot in the soybean feed market. If you look at the figure on your bottom left of your screen, you'll see that in 2021, prices were being marked up by up to 91% to buyers compared to the bulk price in Lusaka for soybean feed. And then if you look at the top right, you'll see that Central and Eastern African prices for fertilizers, and this is data from January to July 2023, are 3 times higher than the world price. All this data coming from the African Markets Observatory that sits at CRED. So we've clearly got a problem here. But what is the state of the competition law and policy in Africa? And do we have policies, laws, and institutions that are able to respond to this anti-competitive conduct? So what we did was we looked at 3 things here. We looked at, is there a law and policy in place in the country? Is there an institution, a competition authority or a commission in place in the country? And what kind of track record are they having in terms of cases? So we used those 3 indicators, and we then basically clustered the 48 sub-Saharan African countries. And what you see here in red, dark red, is that nearly half of the countries in Africa, so 22 out of the 48 sub-Saharan African countries, have no national law or institutions in place, no national competition laws or institutions in place. We then have in yellow a group of countries, 9 countries, where you do have laws and institutions in place, but they're younger than 5 years. So really at the very start. The third group in orange, you have competition laws and authorities in place, but they've got very limited case history, very limited enforcement history, because they've only been around between 5 to 10 years. And then lastly, in green, we really have where the stronghold is for Africa, which are basically established institutions, strong enforcement history, strong enforcement capacity, been more than 10 years around. And unsurprisingly, in green, you'll have the countries where we see some of the most important action being taken by competition authorities to discipline anti-competitive conduct. Whilst this picture overall looks bad, I do want to emphasize, and again, many of you would know this, is that just because there aren't a national law, policy, or institute doesn't mean the countries don't have some kind of legal framework to discipline anti-competitive conduct. So all of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa do benefit from regional competition authorities and regional competition enforcement measures. So all of these countries, even the ones in dark red, can benefit from the fact that we have regional institutions and regional enforcement in place. And that's an important point, because when we come to what needs to be done, that role of the regional institutions is going to be critical for Africa in the next few decades. So what are the 5 things that we found could make a difference? So the first one is really scaling up that support to those 9 green competition African countries where you have mature competition authorities that are doing a fantastic job. And this is support in terms of legal and technical support for cases, for market inquiries, for merger reviews, for ex-post merger reviews, and making sure that there is information available, data available to track what's happening in different sectors and in different markets. The second key thing that needs to happen is to now build that capability of those younger competition authorities, those ones that were in yellow and, can't remember the color, the yellow and orange countries, where they're less than 10 years old, but they are existing and they could benefit from learning from the more mature authorities, again, from legal and technical assistance, and from a market observatory that provides access to timely data and information and analysis. Third key point, as I've just mentioned, given how many countries do not have laws and policies in place, the really important thing is going to be prioritizing regional institutions, cooperation between the national and the regional, and regional enforcement to be able to build this continent-wide response. And this would happen both in the sub-regions, COMESA, ECOWAS, WAMU, but also at the continental level with the new African Free Trade Agreement and the Competition Protocol, and having a much stronger role for the African Union. The competition authorities will not be able to do their jobs effectively without the political support from constituencies in the countries and in the regions. And so the role of advocacy from farmers' organizations, from SME associations, from consumer groups is absolutely critical to giving authorities the legitimacy to act and to empower them to act. And then lastly, and this is a much longer term agenda, but it comes up in one of the reports that I mentioned, is this need for an ongoing reform of existing laws, policies, and institutions, both so that they keep up with the times. You know, there's reforms needed to match this explosion of digital platforms and digital markets. And so the existing laws may not be adapted to deal with those, but also to be able to ensure that there's flexibility and responsiveness in the regimes that exist nationally and regionally. So I'm almost done, Tando, but maybe just 3 key things that I think would support this action agenda. Data, I've mentioned it before. We have at CRED the African Markets Observatory. We need this market observatory tool to be able to work with the authorities, provide them access to data, monitor what's happening, and provide analysis, research, and information. We need cooperation at the regional level. I've mentioned this a lot, so I'll skip through this one quickly. And unless we get the donor community or the development community engaged, we will not be able to take what this global movement is becoming and emerging to Africa. So we do have this global movement. I mean, these two women have probably done more for the competition agenda in the last few years than anyone's done in the last few decades. Activist-minded, you've got Margaret Vestager on the left from the European Commission and Lena Khan on the right from the US Federal Trade Commission. They are taking action. And I really think that Africa can build on that momentum, can build on that activist agenda that we see in Europe and in the US, and start using that to make sure there's action against this anti-competitive conduct in Africa. I will stop there and pass back over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Carin. I think that sets us up really, really well. And I was very glad in the report, and just to acknowledge, I think some of your co-authors are on the call, that even as you kind of diagnose the issues, constraints, and kind of capacity gaps of the authorities, you also point quite convincingly, I would argue, also to what we need to do, right? And a big part of the point really of this webinar is also to really at the end arrive at what you might call a call to action, right? Kind of say, if we did these things, yes, it may take time, but we may start to chip away at some of the challenges that are faced, but also the problems in these markets that the data from the observatory and otherwise is showing. Some of you may have heard reference in Carin's presentation to the African Market Observatory, which is an initiative of CRED. And if you look on our website, you'll be able to find it. It should actually be Googleable as is, if that's the word. And really, this is precisely as Carin has described, which is an initiative to really start to build proper market data on prices and costs and analyze it in ways that are useful for any analyst in this area, including feeding back some of that data to farmers and producers in different countries, as well as also making it widely available to authorities and researchers that are trying to essentially analyze and kind of draw action around these issues. And so this is publicly available, and you're welcome to see it on our website. Heike will probably put something up in the chat about that. All right. So then we move to Eleanor. Eleanor, I mean, Carin sets up some kind of frightening things in terms of you know, for instance, that still the significant gaps in countries that don't have authorities, but also kind of really important things like when you benchmark the African, Central and East Africans urea fertilizer prices against the world prices, they are 3 times the world price, right? And of course, this is, and the team has already, I know, assessed gaps in terms of transport costs, etc. But the point is, there's a link to the international markets here that needs to be considered. And of course, you've been operating as an observer in the African context, but also in the kind of global debate. So I want to switch to you to just ask you to come in with that broader international lens. What are the ongoing debates? Why is there this pressing need for intervention here? But also a bit on some of the potential challenges that you encounter in trying to do so.
Thank you. Thanks, Tando. And it is a pleasure to be here. And thank you for your remarks, and Carin, your remarks, which are really calling attention to the fact this is a crisis. It is an urgent problem. People are dying. People are starving. There's enough food in the world to go around right now before climate change takes over more. And it is not distributed to the people that need it the most. So what I want to do is I want to say a little about the international debate and what we're trying to do to get some buy-in from the international community to the problems of Africa and food and agriculture. And then I want to propose a few recommendations that I want to adopt everything that Carin said and reshuffle them perhaps. So in terms of the international community, there's 3 particular international organizations, but one is the most likely to be helpful to the project, and that is the International Competition Network. And Simon Roberts and Moore Bakum and I brought a very compatible initiative to the ICN, hoping that they would take it on, but we know that they are very particular in what they take on. So the background of ICN is it is an organization of all the competition agencies in the world, but it is actually, as you would expect, the main active players are the developed world, and there's been nothing until now that is focused in particular on the developing world. So we brought to the ICN a project to study and get the members of ICN on board to tell us what data they're collecting, how they're collecting it, what problems they are seeing in food. And this was accepted as a special project by ICN. And we had beginnings of this project at the last annual meeting of the ICN, sort of launching it. And Kenya and South Africa are the two countries members of ICN in charge of the project. They've already been doing active work in sending out a questionnaire to the ICN members. And hopefully we get ICN members on board to help with the project, including a lot about data collection. This actually will be a milestone for ICN in recognizing problems of developing countries. And here I want to say one more word about this and why it's so important. Many of these restraints and problems that are in the food markets and causing the prices to be so high are launched from the developed world. That is, companies, multinational companies in the developed world that are harming the developing world and being totally oblivious. It's not in the harm's not in their market, and they don't care about it. They don't have regard for it. They will say, oh, we don't have jurisdiction on it. This is a really important problem to bring home to them, how they are hurting the developing world and how they must do something about it to constrain and restrain their countries that are doing the cartels and the exploitations. So secondly, I want to say a word about the problems, and then a few recommendations. The problems that are competition-related problems. What is causing the high prices and the scarcity in Africa that is competition law related, as opposed to many other problems that can cause and do cause the prices to rise? And then those problems have to be dissected, put out on the table, and then to see what the agencies in Africa can do about it. So the problems fall into, this is the antitrust possible problems. They fall into several categories. One category is, as Carin and Tondo mentioned, cartels, and cartels are rampant. And this is agreements among competitors, and they harm the consumers, and they are a classic violation of competition. So here's where Carin was saying, just enforce. If you have the evidence and the information, it is an enforcement problem. A huge problem on getting the evidence, the information, and even the power to go against these big guys who have millions of ways of escaping the implications of what they are doing. But secondly, apart from cartels, it could be, you highlight rightly, economic concentration, and antitrust is not good at getting at that unless it is a merger about to happen. And even then, antitrust has been terrible in not stopping the anti-competitive mergers. And this, again, it could be a question of enforcement. If it's a merger, and if it's concentration and it's not a merger, it's a huge problem that antitrust is not good at taking care of. Whoops, I have a minute and a half. So one has to recognize that antitrust can't get at all of the problems. There are other problems of exploitation in the food value chain that are really serious. And antitrust is not very good at getting at problems of, let me say, mere, without belittling it, mere exploitation without a cartel. Okay, that was just to say, there are very serious problems, even when you can say just enforce, there's serious problems of getting the data. And then there are very serious problems that could be cutting edge, and antitrust should go there, but it's not yet going there. And this is maybe a sophisticated problem that has to be second line right now for most of the agencies. Some recommendations. Okay. Number one, this is what one has to do, what you have to do, getting data on cross-border. This requires cooperation. Many of the restraints are cross-border. The agencies must work together. This is where regional comes in and continental comes in, because the restraints are bigger than the countries, and you have to bring together the expertise and the energy and find out where is the data to show, for example, cartels, and how to get at together and have the strength of the collaboration of several countries bringing the cases at the same time because of power against the culprits that is beginning to get at the same level. Okay, so the first one on data, it's just very deep. You have to get the data, sort the data, and find out what the data says about where are the problems. All right, number two is simply capacity building for understanding what are the problems and what is a problem that antitrust can get at and can get at more easily than others. And for the rest, or most of the rest, I wanted to mention particular areas. Basic cartels, cartel problems, they're the most likely, they will, if you get the data, violate the law. And you need capacity, cooperation, sharing across borders, evidence. And you have to overcome problems where the companies say the data is confidential, they way overclaim confidentiality. And you also probably have to overcome a problem where the two different countries might claim a kind of sovereignty and be resistant to the cooperation across borders. The next four, which is number four, abusive conduct. There is much abusive conduct, and much of it is not easily antitrust. Some of it might be. Some of it is what you would call unfair competition that is not caught by antitrust law. And so there's a kind of knowledge that has to come with it, because there's also abusive behavior that's exclusionary, consumer harming, price raising, and within antitrust. 5, on excessive concentration, I already mentioned this. Mergers are a big problem. The African countries are gaining more capacity to enjoin the big mergers with the African protocol. There's finally going to be capacity to say, no, we don't let Bayer and Monsanto merge. And this is so needed. So we're looking forward to that. Number 6, institutional. And Carin, many of your comments related to that, building the institutions, because there's got to be capacity on the ground, regional and continental. And 7, I have down the role of the West. It is so important for a message to be brought home to the West or the global North, as to how they do have responsibility with respect to stopping the anti-competitive actions that their companies are causing in the developing world. So that's my list. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor. I'm glad to also see some overlap with the issues that Carin raises as well. And I want to come back to you on this point of the messaging to the kind of global North as well, right? And trying to link, especially the effects of these issues in developing countries, to a kind of more global agenda and discourse that's emerging, as Carin was saying, because I think this is quite important to create the context for enforcement here as well, particularly as it relates to MNCs or multinational companies and that. Mr. Sampa, you You've kind of in many ways also been at the coalface of dealing with these types of issues and your time at the Zambian authority across sectors, but including cases related to food, experiencing the challenges, but also I think getting some of the wins that come with taking on the difficult cases, especially in important goods, food products, etc., that affect the poorest of consumers. I wanted you to maybe reflect on some of the remarks made by Carin and Eleanor, but also just sharing with us a bit of the reality of enforcement, answering the central question that I'm sure many of us have is how you might get authorities to act, to be more active in these spaces. Why do some authorities act and others don't? But also what are the possibilities to kind of towards a call to action, if you will. Over to you.
Thanks, Tando, and thanks to the organizers of this webinar. Enforcement and looking at the practicalities of enforcement, one has to recognize the fact that most of the African competition authorities are less than 30 years old. So they're generally very young authorities. And so when we talk about capacity, when we talk about them financial capacity and human resource capacity, and the issues that have been mentioned by the previous speakers, Carin and Eleanor, about having data and being able to use that data and evidence to be able to bring to forward an investigation on cartels, or even reviewing an abuse of dominance case or a restrictive business practice case, it becomes kind of difficult, especially for new authorities. But the good thing is that these authorities are gaining capacity over time. So there are a number of things, realizing that we're only 30 years old, and those are the oldest authorities with, as Carin had said, only about 9 of them have got 10 years experience and over. That means a number of things. Resources are scarce. That means both financial and human resources. So investigations, if they are carried out, are not carried out fully. We don't have the capacity, we don't have the human resource. You lack maybe experts to be able to carry out these investigations. And I know some authorities also do hire experts to do a bit of investigations for them, but that, again, because you do not have the financial resources, it becomes difficult for you to do that. Then there's the issue of competition institutions not being fully developed, of course, except for a few, as has been mentioned in the first presentation. So you need to then have to pass laws that would be able to sort of ensure that the institutions can be able to carry out these investigations. And you also need to have stakeholders, such as the civil society, the donors, including the judiciary as well, to be made more aware of what is happening with what is going on with competition law and how it is affecting poverty reduction. You need also to somewhat realize that because the private sector, the concentrations that have been spoken about are so powerful that they have the government's ears, unlike the competition authority. So you can see, like in the Oxfam report that Carin had mentioned, the inequality clearly shows that the private sector have become so powerful that they can influence government decisions. So when specifically looking at the investigations, there is also a situation that I observed that if a merger comes, for example, and it's in the seed market, for example, authorities then tend to focus just on that particular relevant market and not necessarily looking at the whole value chain. And meanwhile, what you see with the private sector, because they have a bigger picture and using, and I suppose competition authorities are being restricted with the tools that they have. They are able to come up with creeping measures. They come into the seed market, then they come into the fertilizer market, then they come into the staples market, really like going through the whole value chain. Before you realize it, you actually discover that the concentration has, in the various markets, all belong to basically one or two individual firms. So we have seen, the good thing is that COMESA Competition Authority, and I know the Kenyans and the Zambians are now taking up market studies that are sort of looking at an overall. And I think the market observatory that Trade is doing is also putting impetus on that, so that you are able to see exactly what's happening in the whole value chain. Talking about opportunities, yes, the opportunities are there. The fact that food is essential for human survival, it means you can easily and quickly get support from the public. You can get support from the civil society, your parliament, and the donor community. It's easy for you to get that support if you are investigating cases in the food market, and you're trying to stop hunger, and you're trying to reduce or even eliminate poverty. There are also opportunities between competition authorities actually sharing non-confidential information. I don't know why competition authorities sometimes don't do this, but it is important that they should, especially that the private sector is not restricted by jurisdiction. They will operate in whichever market they want to operate across borders, whereas competition authorities may be restricted. And this also now comes to sort of agree with Carin's recommendation that regional competition authorities need to actually be supported, because they have this a greater jurisdiction than the national authorities. Then you also need to advocate to government. Yes, while the 9 authorities have made quite some stride, but we also see that there can be some backlash from the government not knowing exactly what the competition authority is doing, and that can sort of reduce or dampen the progress that has been happening. And of course, there was the review of legislation and guidelines. What incentivizes competition authorities to act? Well, one of the things that I'm thinking is that if you have a regional body, they have a better chance of investigating cases, because they are not, they don't suffer the same political pressure than the national authority. You know, when you go regional, it's not just the one government, it's many governments. And so that becomes much, much easier. And I'm sure maybe I've seen Ali Kamanga is on the call. He'll be able maybe to speak more on that, to say, look, we don't suffer the same way a national authority in terms of political pressure. I recall that there were times when I received political pressure, or I see a potential of a merger that would cause some political pressure within Zambia, I would then refer that case to the COMESA Competition Authority, because then even if they come to me, I'll say, no, well, I'm not the one doing it. This is a regional case. You see, that is it's a way of going around some of the challenges that we face as national authorities. Civil society support, what the sponsors of this seminar are doing, what Shamba Center is doing, what CATS, Consumer Unit Trust Society, has been doing in supporting competition authorities. That is another way you can incentivize competition authorities to actually act. And then also the donors. I think Carin had spoken about that. What forces others to act and don't, and others not to act? Like I said, politicians will interfere. You may need to strengthen the law. And when I say strengthen the law, I'm not just talking about the competition law. No, I'm talking about the whole framework. Having more independent institutions of governance that can actually push back from something that a politician may want, or from political influence. Lack of data and evidence. That can definitely cause an authority not to act. It becomes very difficult for you, even if you know that, oh, that cartel was busted in South Africa. How are you going to bring it into Zambia if you do not have the data and the evidence? It becomes very, very difficult. And especially when sometimes agreements are actually made outside Zambia or outside Malawi, but they were made in South Africa. So hence the cooperation between competition authorities is very, 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 very important. And then sometimes it's just the capacity to investigate cases. Some competition authorities just don't have that capacity. And I think, again, to agree with Carin, to just say that that's the reason why you need to build this capacity in competition authorities. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mr. Sampa. I think there's certainly points raised by the speakers that overlap and are focused on how to fix the issues as opposed to kind of lamenting their existence. And I think this is really important. I want to pick up as we start to move to dealing with some of the questions, but also as part of my reflections on your remarks. Carin, you mentioned from the report this important role that the kind of donor community has to play, right? And I think it's in some ways linked to technical assistance. It's linked to issues around kind of raising the profile of these issues in ways, as Mr. Sampa says, that the authorities may not be empowered within their countries themselves to raise, given perhaps other political economy considerations. But maybe to reflect on Malik Dasu's question in the chat, which is, you know, what could we get and what could we ask for from a wider kind of internationalized donor community? And I know, of course, this is a space that you're very familiar with.
So I'll answer that question. And then there's also a question in the Q&A about the low-hanging fruit, which I think is a similar question. So I think there is a very effective but very tiny community of competition practitioners, like you, Mr. Sampa, like you, Tando, like many people in this call, who have the skills and the expertise to support the competition authorities. But you are all grossly underfunded. You do not have the resources you need to be able to build effective teams and provide that effective support. And with small amounts of funding to the AMO, to CRED, to the group of practitioners that form around the ICN, around the African Competition Network, you would give those practitioners who exist and have the skills, the resources they need to be able to provide that support to the authorities. And it's not huge money we're talking about. I think hundreds of thousands or millions is enough. And in the scale of the billions of aid we give and the hundreds of millions that go to trade or investment initiatives, if a small proportion of that went to the competition community that was providing support, either in terms of technical assistance, legal assistance, economic analysis, data collection, if you guys had the resources you needed, you could be 3 times more effective than you currently are. So I think in terms of these low-hanging fruit, there are people doing the low-hanging fruit. There are people helping authorities with market inquiries, helping them with cases, helping them with merger reviews. You have the AMO, but not sufficiently resourced to do the job as well as it could be done if there was proper resourcing and long-term funding. So that's where I would start. And then you would let it grow. You would see how effective that was in stopping this anti-competitive conduct. And I think the point that Eleanor raises about how difficult it is to block mergers. So maybe on cartels we could get success, but unlikely on mergers. And if you see what's happening in the rest of the world, it's really these mergers that are creating these monopolies. So you maybe need to then do law reform around stronger merger rules that would make it easier, maybe make the burden of proof on the company to prove that it's not anti-competitive, the merger, rather than the burden of proof on the authority to prove that it is harmful. But something needs to happen there around mergers to make the legal frameworks more effective. But there's a lot you could do in the meantime.
Thanks, Carin. I think that's quite pragmatic as well. And I know there's a number of organizations represented here. And I think this is absolutely true, right? Is that there's gaps we can fill, including just the low-hanging fruit of supporting authorities to be able to do market studies and this kind of thing. That could quite easily potentially be addressed with support from the wider kind of donor community, as it has done in trade and other kind of financial national payment system issues and that as well. Eleanor, a question or a comment that Odie makes in the chat is around, of course, some of the most kind of highly problematic mergers that the COMESA, certainly the COMESA Competition Commission has been dealing with, are in kind of really important markets: banking, financial service, agriculture, as we're discussing here today. And she hints at a potential kind of idea here, which is that should we be thinking about a kind of regional or kind of cross-continental prioritization of certain sectors for countrywide kind of enforcement, or at least observatory? So, for instance, saying that we have issues in food markets, and that all authorities, either through the ACF, the African Competition Forum, or otherwise, should be actually isolating markets in which they could start to work together. And I'm saying this in the context also, of course, that the kind of continental regulators still to come, as it were, the FCTA linked one. But there are things we might be able to do now. Some thoughts on that? In terms of,
yes, this should be prioritized. Food agriculture should definitely be prioritized. And you can think of that together with what we were just talking about, mergers. In my view, mergers, it's sort of similar to cartels, that you do have the tools in the law. And mergers, one huge problem is in the area of, this merger is anti-competitive, and then the question is, what do you do about it? And if the developed world simply says, oh, I know there are anti-competitive aspects of Bayer Monsanto, and I'll take care of them with conditions and spin-offs for myself and my country, and then gives the problem to Africa, where the harms are greater and the power to get the relief is much less. And they're not enjoining these mergers. They could save billions of dollars and have better food supply, like better seeds, better fertilizer. If they enjoin the mergers, they are not taking the opportunity that they have right in front of them to enjoin the merger. So going back to the capacity within Africa and regionals, COMESA was in that bind because the developed countries hadn't done what they should have done. They should have enjoined the biggest mergers. If that big merger goes up to Africa continental enforcement, there's power to argue, even to the developed enforcers. Yes, we've got to enjoin this merger, not put conditions on it. Conditions end up being, some can be more important than others, but they can end up being band-aids and they don't solve the problem. You need to enjoin mergers. There's power to enjoin mergers, but there's there's legal power to enjoin mergers. There's not practical power unless the African countries get together.
Sure. This is quite important when thinking about regional action. Mr. Sampa, in that you made the example of certain matters that you've in fact referred back or to the COMESA authority for regional action because it brings certain advantages. One of the issues that Carin raises, and you've obviously worked closely with them on the report as well, is that you still have these kind of pockets where you have authorities that either don't exist or where you don't even have kind of competition law in place, right? But an idea here that seems to be coming through as well is that even if you have those gaps in enforcement where countries don't have laws, etc., the fact that a regional authority would in any event look at, for example, a Bayer-Monsanto merger and perhaps prohibit it or put conditions on it would in any event have benefits for the countries that aren't able to act on those mergers because maybe they don't have authorities. Something that's workable?
Yes,
Or are we
indeed.
missing something here?
No, you're not. Actually, you hit the nail on the head. It is something that is workable. It's something that can be done. And I think it's something that COMESA has continuously done, where there is a COMESA member state that does not have a competition authority, and there is a merger that affects that particular member state. COMESA will always still look at the interests of that particular member state. And that is something that has been done. And I think that goes for each and every regional body. Most of the laws are structured in such a way that if there is a cross-border merger or cross-border case that's affecting the members of that regional body, the regional body has the jurisdiction to actually look at it, even if that member state does not have a competition authority, or they do not even have a competition law, and that is what we are encouraging, and we would want to see that the regional bodies take up this mantle and sort of spearhead the development of competition authorities and competition policies and laws in their member states, and I think that is one of key issues that at least I can speak for the COMESA Competition Authority, having been a board member there at one time. I can speak for them in that one of their mandates was to ensure that all member states, one, have competition policies and they have competition laws. And that was one of their mandates, and they would support countries to ensure that they achieve that.
Can I follow up with you around these issues? I mean, one of the questions that's raised in the chat by Refilo is around, I think we've seen really great action, or at least much better urgency, especially around kind of food pricing when we had COVID and some of the food price pressure issues that are arising out of the war in Ukraine as well. Where governments have acted quite promptly to address price issues and issues that affect consumers directly. And yet somehow there might be a gap, and this is really to the other speakers as well, in that, are we not doing enough to raise the urgency and importance and kind of the crisis aspects of the issues in food markets to trigger that kind of level of coordinated action across countries, but also within them? Are there gaps? Do we not know enough to be able to demonstrate harm and therefore engender action? Or are we almost there? I don't know if you're going to pick it up first, and then I'll ask Carin and Eleanor to comment. Like maybe we're just dreaming, but we haven't said enough just yet.
There could be gaps here and there, but I think this is where the issue of cooperation between competition authorities becomes very, very important. If, for example, one national authority seems to be facing a challenge or has observed or identified a particular sector, and there's a challenge in terms of competition, while the others have not. I think this is where the cooperation comes in, and I think there's been a lot of, no, we cannot share information because it's confidential, we cannot do this and so on. And sometimes priorities of the different authorities may be different because they really follow what their governments are doing. So if one government is saying food is an important issue, another government is saying, no, for us it's infrastructure and so on. So you have those, different perspectives or different objectives between the national authorities. However, there is still room for the competition authorities to sit together, and I mean, we have the African Competition Forum. That is a very good place to start, where they can start cooperating among themselves and trying to ensure that the gaps that may exist can be bridged, and it's very, very possible. We can start with non-confidential information, just sharing the investigation, the cases that you are investigating with your fellow competition authority, as a start. Maybe sharing what type of investigative techniques you're going to use in handling a particular case. That is not confidential. That is something that you can share with another competition authority. So just bridging these little gaps can have positive impact in the long run.
Carin,
Just add to this. I think, and there's also the point by Good Luck Temu in there about the politics of it. But I think part of the problem is that this issue is not unique to agriculture, as we've seen. It's everywhere. It's in all economic sectors. And it's arguably not the worst in food and ag markets, if you look at like the digital platforms, for example. And the other problem you have with food and ag is that it's always your poorest economic sector. It's always the economic sector that brings in the least amount of GDP, even if it's the one that supports the biggest number of people and where most of the hungry and poor are. But it's not your biggest economic sector. So if you want to make the biggest economic impact, and that's what we've seen, the US and EU ag and food markets have been heavily concentrated for decades, maybe even centuries. But when did we act? When it was the rise of these digital platforms. It's basically Amazon, Google, and Apple that's triggered this massive backlash because of how big it is and how much it counts for. So I think that's going to be always a problem with the food and ag sectors. It's always going to be a dwarf among giants in other sectors. It's always going to be the one that affects the poorest the most, poorest consumers who suddenly see their prices doubling, having to pay more for food, poorest producers. Those are the ones who are going to be worst hit, and they're the ones who are the most invisible when it comes to political and economic power. So I think this point on the politics of it is really challenging.
Yeah. And putting out the information on the markups, on the issues. Eleanor, do you want to come in?
So I just want to emphasize what you just said, Carin. Maybe that's a point that actually will appeal to donors, that it is the poorest, that the impacts on food are much greater in developing countries. The developed countries aren't seeing it as much because the impacts are lesser. And I think that donors might have the conscience to be particularly concerned that this is a life and death problem, and especially in developing countries, and especially that the donors are usually from the developed world, developing the conscience and the consciousness of whom they are hurting and killing.
Yeah. I can see the kind of basis for the call to action forming.
Oh, yes.
There was a question that I wanted to raise, but maybe I see Parrot Muteto has raised his hand from the Zambia Competition Authority. Parrot, do you wanna come in? I just need to enable you. There you go. You can go ahead.
Yes. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
And it's a great discussion, and indeed, I think the most affected are from the developing countries and the poor countries. I just wanted to largely food markets are driven by the private sector and affect pretty much the entire population of these developing countries. And these enterprises over time tend to concentrate their markets, behave in a certain manner over regional markets, and authorities may not be able to see the bigger picture because obviously of resource constraints. So how can authorities, in this case, really be assisted, given the substantial resources that may be required, to effectively put a scan on these markets and ensure that the markets work to the benefit of consumers and also without negating the need to promote economic growth? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if any of the speakers want to respond. I have some thoughts as well. But it's really this issue of And I think this is really important, Parrot, and you would have seen this in some of the issues that we've worked together on as well, is that if you're kind of focused at a local market level in analyzing a particular market, and maybe there's consumer concerns about the price of bread or whatever it might be, or certain agricultural products, you might not observe at the authority level that the problem is potentially regional, right? And that you're actually dealing with either African multinationals, which is often not spoken about as potentially being part of the issue in some instances, alongside the global multinationals. Essentially looking at the region or pockets of the region, say East Africa or Southern Central Africa, as one single market. And so coordinating their strategies, plans, investments, etc., across Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, etc., whereas at a country level, you're still kind of focused on the local market issues. And so this ability to zoom out and having the data that you can compare across countries, I think is really, really important. Because often that's also how you pick up that, oh, actually there is a problem when we start to see that our prices for product X are considerably higher than those in my neighboring country. Right? But you do not observe this without that type of regionalized lens.
I think that's exactly where the sort of the mix of this, making sure there's an market observatory tool that's collecting the data and that has the resources to properly collect data and collect it in a timely way, combined with this regional cooperation at the regional level, cooperation between the regions and the countries, that you enable that kind of information sharing to take more effective action. And then that action can be both regional and national. It doesn't have to be exclusively one or the other, but it's the mix of all of that that allows you to then deal with this case that Parrot Muteto described.
Yes, and I just want to agree. Actually, when Thando and Carin were speaking, I put down 3 words. Data, you need data. You need the donors to fund the collection of data, and then you need regional enforcement. That is basically what would answer what Parrot is asking.
All right, I think we should start to move to a close, though there's quite a bit going on in the chat and in the Q&A. I see some of it's been responded to. I know there's a question earlier by, I think it was Luke, around the kind of roles that, so I think he contextualizes by saying, obviously, a lot of the discussion has to do with national authorities and even bigger at the kind of multinational level in terms of regional authorities and that as well. But of course, a lot of the problems that you would observe and where they have the greatest impact are often in local or district level, for instance, in different countries, specific counties, etc., where you have extreme concentration of, say, a supplier of fertilizer. Or whatever the case might be. And I think these are really important. Luke, just to say there that, and I'll ask Carin to come in on this as well, but that part of the work of the observatory is building up the data, at least in the countries that we've gotten to so far, at the local market level, because I think you're absolutely right that there may be dimensions and things playing out at local markets that you may not see if you're looking at aggregate data across countries. And we've looked at a number of different countries. And so the data is gathered at the level of producers and kind of localized markets as well. And I think the expansion of that database is going to be really, really important. Because in that instance, you then have the evidence, or the starting point of the evidence, to be able to advocate for change in even localized markets, right? Where there may be consumer concerns. But I think there might be more to this than certainly I've covered. Carin, I think you'd indicated you wanted to respond to this.
No, I'm good. I've said what I wanted to say.
Oh, I see. It's covered, actually. I mean, there are related issues around biopower, and I think we won't get to everything now. I wanted to use a couple of, or steal kind of 3 or 4 more minutes just to also come back to the panelists and kind of reflecting on the discussion, but also where we need to go. And maybe some thoughts on the absolute priorities in terms of a call to action here. So what you would rank as your perhaps 1 or 2 issues that really need to get on the agenda of authorities straight away. And perhaps even a sense of the audience, so kind of who needs to act. If it's donors, or otherwise, so that you can kind of start to, and we can certainly from our side start to agitate for engagement with those actors as well. What do we need to do right away, given the myriad of issues that are on the table? Mr. Sampa?
Oh, you start with me. Okay. First and foremost, I think it is important for authorities to enforce. If we talk about advocacy, there is no better way of advocating than through enforcement. And when I say enforce, sometimes we don't want just to enforce so that at the end of the day, you win the case. But even if you do not win the case, it is important that you show to the powers that be and to the public that you are an institution which has got powers, and that you are actually using those powers that have been given to you by the parliament of that country. It is very, very important, because that speaks volumes and also sends a signal to the private sector and to everyone else, each and every stakeholder that may be involved, including the donors, that you are capable, or at least if you're not capable, you need capacity building, it will show through your enforcement efforts. The second thing that needs to be done is advocacy. And when I talk about advocacy, I said enforcement is the best advocacy tool. But aside from that, you can still show through advocacy stories, the donors and other stakeholders, including your parliament and your government, what competition policy and law how it can benefit the poor and how it can benefit the vulnerable. So those would be my two things.
Understood. Nice and clear. Dare I say, even taking on cases that where it's not necessarily clear that you're going to win. Am I pushing it too far? Because I think even just the act sometimes of getting the messaging into the public that we will take on these issues and we'll fight it out in court. But one thing we will do is that we are watching the markets, and we have the willingness to act, I think, is quite important to signal as well. Because I suppose if you wait for the dream case, it may never come, the one that you're absolutely certain of winning. Yeah. Shall we go to Carin and then ask Eleanor to bring us home?
Thanks. So, I mean, my first one is data and information, which we've all said, but I really think, Odie Stridham's in the room here, who runs a website called Betweenity, but it's behind a paywall. And so only the law firms are accessing it, because she couldn't get funding to fund an information hub that provides information on the continent, on news, events, laws, cases. This thing should be in the public domain, and the donors should be funding it. It should not be behind a paywall and only accessible to law firms. The AMO is chronically underfunded. You could probably quadruple your staff and therefore expand your reach at CRED. It needs to have long-term and sufficient funding to be able to provide that data that the authorities need to be able to do their jobs better. So that's a must. It's a prerequisite. The second, I mean, Chilufya said it on regional enforcement, but this would not be for donors to do. I think the regional economic commissions need to step up and do an advocacy campaign with the national competition authorities. They need to go out and build the support and build the relations and start doing that work so that the next time a merger is notified, they're acting together. But I think there's some advocacy work that needs to come out of those regional economic commissions. I think COMESA is one of the most advanced on the continent, but there needs to be some efforts there to make that cooperation and coordination happen. And then the third thing I would say is, I feel like it looks like in terms of market inquiries, cases, merger reviews, there could be the case for having an on-demand legal and technical advisory service where you've got a group of trained competition lawyers and competition economists that are able, on demand, financed by donor money, to be able to support authorities when they know they can do something, when they know they can start a case, when they've got enough data that they can start a case, that they can do an inquiry, that they can do a review, that you've got this legal and technical service available to be mobilized on demand. That would be my 3.
Spot on. Interesting as well. The kind of authority-focused guns for hire, if you will. Eleanor?
So thank you. So I have the ability to say, and I adopt what has just been proposed before, and going on. I think there are several levels that we have to deal with so capacity building of the agencies that need so much more capacity. Number 2, as Sampa said, enforcement, but this depends on what you're capable of doing. So for the agencies capable of doing right now, the cartel cases, do the enforcement. You need a higher level for the mergers, more cooperation, regional, or hopefully it's going to be continental. Enforce and join the mergers, don't just condition them. My last is some combination of advocacy and leadership, much more publicity about the plight of poor countries, poorer populations, and how the vulnerable keep getting higher prices than the better enabled. An international campaign, not just a national and local, definitely local, but also an international campaign of advocacy. And this feeds into leadership. There has to be a strong voice, and a strong voice at the top. And I'm looking forward and hoping to see an African Continental Protocol. If you had a strong voice in Africa for Africa, this could be pulling the pieces together and motivating the various levels according to their abilities of what they can do.
Right. Thanks, Eleanor. I think there's quite a bit there for us to work with, right? And I say us, I kind of really refer to the community of practitioners and interested people, academics. I saw there's a scholar in there currently doing their PhD in the chat as well. So generally people working on these issues, there's quite a bit there for us to anchor on as far as a kind of call to action is concerned, right? I think even just going earlier to the discussion, the kind of issues around the underfunding, or at least certainly the greater support needed by authorities, and where the donors could play an important role, I think is front and center, just as they have done in other areas of commerce and trade, etc. I think this issue, as Eleanor mentioned earlier, of mainstreaming, prioritizing issues around food markets is absolutely essential. Right? And I think this is especially important in the context of the shifts in the climate conditions, etc., across different parts of the continent, right? Where it's not just, where part of the responsiveness, or at least part of the response and the ability for people to still be able to eat when there's climate variability, etc., is to have functional regional markets for food, right? Where borders work, but also where cross-border trade and competition can happen as potential sources. The issue around the big mergers, I think, came across as really quite important, right? And so I know the EU and other jurisdictions have done a lot of this work, especially around digital, which is obviously the preoccupation of our broader community overseas, certainly, around looking back at mergers and transactions that have happened and kind of saying now, gosh, we think we should have enforced more harshly or more strongly to deal with the early mergers around Google, whatever the case might be. I think that should be a lesson to us about forthcoming or potential forthcoming big or mega mergers or multi-country mergers in food in particular on the continent. Right? That is to the extent that we don't miss an opportunity again to seriously scrutinize those types of cases. And as Eleanor saw, even potentially enjoy where there's the evidence in the case to do so. certain transactions. And then just to wrap up, lastly, I think there's a kind of hit list of about 7 issues there that have come across in the final remarks, and some of which are blended with what's been in the chat. The need to enforce, right? As the best form of advocacy at the level of authorities, even as part of capacity building, in fact, because you learn from cases tried as well, as the South African authority will tell you. And then the linked activities around advocacy, and I think to link it with what Eleanor said, is also international advocacy around this. So bringing the evidence that says the harm is to the most vulnerable, so that you can latch on to this global agenda around these issues. And then, of course, I do like the kind of very practical ideas around really, really deepening the ability to have data that is publicly available on these issues, to have reporting on cases, on platforms like the AMO, like Betweenity, etc., but also to set up the capacity to even support authorities directly in their technical interventions, or at least at a technical level in terms of legal and economic evidentiary support for cases, which I think happens currently at a very ad hoc level, but really needs to be systematized, I think, especially for younger authorities. And then lastly, of course, capacity building, right, around authorities. And part of that involves working with authorities on cases and not necessarily training workshops, right, and kind of finding a blend of that. Because certainly there's always room for more of that, especially as the community grows. You've got a lot of junior staffers in authorities, but also those around the area that would need to learn more about these issues and then can start studying it and reporting on them. So I just want to conclude by thanking, I know we're a bit over time, but I kind of got quite latched into the discussion, so that's all on me. But importantly, to thank the African Climate Foundation again for supporting CRED to anchor these webinars through its African Food Systems Transformation Collective and other engagements that we've had with them. This is truly appreciated and has enabled the greater reach of this work. I want to thank Carin, Chilufya and Eleanor as kind of advocates in this space, and to kind of encourage you that in your work in supporting authorities and continuing this work, because I think at some point we will have the big cases and there will be breakthroughs in some of these issues for sure. Right, and I invite you to access the website of, for instance, the Shamba Center, but also Eleanor's work, which is widely available on African authorities and food markets, etc. Just to thank on our side, on the CRED side, and of course, Mr. Sampa as well, who's now working, we've kind of been a broad network over the years working on these issues, but to bring those insights from the practical level of enforcing. But I think really important work that you're doing now in working with authorities based on the lessons in Zambia and your track record in enabling authorities to act, right? And I think this is important advocacy work, and some might say you're doing the Lord's work, and so thank you for that. And lastly, just to thank the team on our side and the CRED side. There is a link in the chat that refers to the CRED initiative being the African Market Observatory, where you can find the different papers, what we call a price tracker, which comes out very regularly on food markets, on prices, on costs, etc., in different food value chains, which is publicly available for people to use and access, and of course contact the team there as well. To thank Heike, Simon, and the rest of the AMO team on our side that kind of do the hard work of generating this data on the ground. We're based in Rosebank, but we hardly see the AMO team because really they're out there in Rwanda, in Tanzania, Kenya, etc., working with authorities and gathering data and kind of trying to pull all of this together, which I think is really, really important work. Right, and lastly, to thank the participants on the call, those of you that have joined in. I know we've gone a bit over time, but I really appreciate the very vibrant chat, and of course, the continued support of CRED's work in these areas. And of course, you can always follow up by email if there's any further questions, or if you'd like us to share particular information, etc. Our work is publicly available. I think that's it from my side. If I haven't thanked anyone, my apologies. Colleagues, thank you very much. Good evening, or certainly good morning, and enjoy the rest of your day where you might be until the next engagement on these issues. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tendo. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.